We're going to get into, from a MSI prevention perspective, how do we build an effective program? How do we set people up for success? How do we minimize the risk for injuries? Um, and really, what's the roadmap for that process look like? So we'll get into that in more detail. I'm going to start with a really quick introduction of myself, and then really we're going to dive into the content here. I got a lot to get through, so we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A. And the other thing I'll note as well, this webinar, once it's finished, we get the recording. It'll be available in the future on our MSABC website as well. I'll actually show you guys where you can access that as we get further into the content here. So really quickly, guys, an introduction to myself. As I mentioned, I'm the ergonomist specialist advisor with MSABC. My background, I have a bachelor's in kinesiology, certificate in occupational ergonomics, and then I also have a master's in ergonomics and human factors. I've been working in ergonomics, MSI prevention for a long time. Started out in kind of more general health and safety, but really specialized from there to focus on ergonomics. I worked in manufacturing for a long time, used to work for Pepsi Beverages North America, worked for Frito-Lay North America, spent a long time in manufacturing, in logistics, really addressing this challenge of, again, these musculoskeletal injuries, these strains and sprains, these, overexertion or repetitive motions that get put on workers based on the job tasks that they do every day. And really, again, my role with MSABC is to support our members in addressing this challenge, right? Figuring out what works well for their organization, helping them build capability, educate their workers, and provide resourcing and action plans around how to then implement that long term, really have an effective program to drive that long term mitigation. I'll really jump in now to our learning objectives for the session. So again, the whole goal of today is talk a little bit about what that roadmap looks like. So, maybe you have a challenge. How do we, right, take action on that? How do we drive that forward in terms of the opportunity? So we'll start up just by setting the table a little bit, understanding what the current challenges are, and really what the scale of impact of musculoskeletal injuries are. We'll get into, what are the requirements? I'll talk a little bit about, in particular, from a British Columbia WorkSafe BC perspective, what the requirements are around ergonomics, what the relevant sections of the regulations are, just to level set in terms of, again, what the expectations are. And then we'll really get into, well, how do you implement an effective program, right? What does that look like? What do I need in place? And then how do I drive that long term? So not just that initial implementation, but the long-term execution, long-term sustainment, and the long-term mitigation, which at the end of the day is really our goal. And we'll talk a little bit about, again, how MSABC can support you through that journey, both in terms of consultation, in terms of resourcing, in terms of helping you build action plans around that. I want you to recognize, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff today, but you're never on your own. You're always welcome to reach out. We're happy to help. We're happy to provide support in action planning and really getting in front of this problem and taking action on it to prevent workers from getting hurt in the first place. So as I noted, I'm just going to level set here a little bit just to start, talk a little bit about the prevalence of MSIs in British Columbia. I'll talk about how it impacts people and organizations. We'll get into some of the current barriers in terms of ergonomic program success, MSI prevention success. I want to talk a little bit about how MSIs develop as well. I think part of the challenge sometimes when it comes to managing risk around musculoskeletal injuries is understanding how they actually develop. Right? So many of our safety programs, the risks, the exposures are acute. There's a single moment in time that leads to that incident happening. Someone removes a guard, they stick their hand into that piece of equipment, and the incident happens. Versus with MSIs, while there are instances of these acute exposures, often it's this cumulative wear and tear, this exposure to these repetitive actions over time that then contribute to that risk for injury. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that because I think when we recognize how these things happen, how these MSIs emerge, it makes it easier to then walk back and say, well, what do I need in place to prevent that then? How do I take action from an ergonomics improvement perspective to ensure folks aren't going to get hurt? And then in the next section, we're going to really talk about, well, what are the important parts of an MSI program? Again, I'll reference some of the WorkSafe BC regulations, but really the steps that we're going to talk about, the process, it's relevant to anyone, right? Whether you're in British Columbia, whether you're in British Columbia manufacturing specifically, this process can be used to implement and drive, a sustainable, effective ergonomics program for any organization. So one thing, when we look at the data over time, injuries are trending down. You can see that orange line there in terms of the time loss claims rate. Safety's been effective. We've been able to go out there and attack a lot of these risks that are in the workplace, mitigate them, drive down those risk levels, help protect workers. And that's a really, really powerful thing. The challenge is when we look at the breakdown of those metrics, especially in more recent years, ergonomics, MSI, these overexertion, repetitive strain type injuries, are still the number one driver, right? When we look at the breakdown, and this is from the 2024 annual report statistics from WorkSafe BC, 39% of these injuries driven from this overexertion bodily motion category. So when we look at it specifically for BC manufacturing, again, you can see kind of over the past 10 years here, kind of hovering around that 31 to 34% range. So basically 1 in 3 injuries are MSIs, are these ergonomic strain and sprain type injuries. And so it's important to recognize that this is a persistent challenge. And as we can see based on kind of the line, it's not trending down. It's still something that we're really, really challenged with. So how do we get out there? How do we take action on this? And how do we, again, get that practical benefit from implementing these effective programs? So again, number one injury type that we see, this kind of breaks down some of that in a little more detail as well. So again, 1 in 3 of those injuries being MSIs. Over that 10-year period, almost 20,000 total MSI claims. And again, this is just BC manufactured. When you expand it to look at the province more broadly and even across Canada, we're talking about tens, hundreds of thousands of people that are suffering from these musculoskeletal injuries in the workplace. And when you take kind of the average claim cost, it's a lot of money that these organizations are also spending in terms of addressing these challenges, covering these claim costs, managing these injuries on the back end, both in terms of those direct costs, the premiums we pay, medical and rehabilitation costs, the legal expenses, but also the indirect costs. Absenteeism and turnover, lost productivity, rehiring, retraining, and investigations. A lot of costs go into those indirect buckets as well, and often more than even just the direct costs. So I think it's important to recognize this is a big challenge for organizations, right? These are people going to work, trying to provide for their family who are getting hurt every day. Right, that's not acceptable. We want to make sure that we're getting out there and we're protecting workers, but it also costs our organization, right? That's a big sink in terms of costs when we think about both those direct and indirect costs. And this was just released in February from WorkSafe BC, where they kind of talked about an update around some of the metrics when they did the new statistical report. Again, MSIs remain the most common workplace injury in BC, again, for manufacturing, but across industries as well. When they broke that down, 88,000 time loss claims in that 5-year period across all industries. 30% of all WorkSafe time loss claims related to MSI. So a big chunk, again, of these injuries, of these costs that we're seeing are coming from poor ergonomics in the workplace. The other thing I think is important to recognize as well is WorkSafe BC is recognizing this challenge, is recognizing this, and they're putting additional focus on, from an inspectional perspective, MSIs, on ergonomics, getting out there, identifying where, especially for these high-risk workplaces, what they have in place for ergonomics, what they've done from an MSI prevention perspective, where they land in relation to, again, some of those requirements laid out from the regulations. We'll get into that more in a second here, but I think it's important to recognize, right? This is a focus area, and so organizationally, how do we prioritize it? How do we, from an efficiency perspective, get out there, take action, get the most bang for our buck in terms of, again, having success in identifying these risks, assessing them, prioritizing them, controlling them, and protecting workers at the end of the day. That is the ultimate goal. And so when we talk about MSIs, I mentioned this at the start, but I think it's really critical that we understand how MSIs develop so that then we can work backwards from that to say, well, what do we need to do to prevent them? How do we ensure that from a risk management perspective, we're attacking this problem as effectively as we can? I think acute injuries, this is really, easy for us to understand in terms of there's kind of one single overexertion, one single exposure that leads to that injury happening. I jump down from the cab of my truck, I land on my ankle a little funny and it rolls over, and there's that immediate, really high force that the ligaments, potentially the tendons in my ankle need to absorb. That force is just too high. It's too much of an overexertion on that tissue, and the tissue fails, right? We get that injury, we get that trauma directly to those soft tissues of the body. And so, again, from a instant perspective, it's pretty easy for us to point at, well, what led to that injury happening, and certainly we can have, a thoughtful conversation about why they made that decision. Maybe, again, from a root cause analysis perspective, maybe they felt they needed to rush. Maybe there were time pressures being placed on them. Maybe there was other psychosocial risk factors that were present that influenced that. But from an analysis perspective, we can very clearly link the incident and the outcome in terms of that injury. What's more challenging is these cumulative injuries, where we see this repetitive loading, typically lower forces, and they tend to develop over time. And I'm going to get into this in more detail in a sec, but this is really the more challenging category. And this is the breadth and the vast majority of MSIs that we see in the workplace. So, when we think about this, I'm out there working on a floor, I'm an order picker maybe, I'm working in a warehouse, I'm working in a production area where I'm handling parts. Every time I bend down to pick that object up, to interact with that part, there's an applied force. And in particular, we'll talk about maybe the low back right now. So every time I bend down, there's this applied force on the muscles, the tendons in my lower back. And as I perform that activity, especially repetitively, there's this wear and tear that happens, right? There's this exposure that fatigues those specific tissues that I'm using in that instance. And again, in this case, it would be, those erector muscles of my spine. And what can happen when that exposure is too high, too prolonged, too repetitive, worker isn't getting adequate rest recovery, over time, what can happen is we see this slow degradation of the tissue tolerance. So those tissues, they get worn out, they get fatigued, they get overexerted. And from that, we can see this slow degradation where eventually, I like to think of it almost as like this idea of the straw that breaks the camel's back. Maybe that's a task that they've done hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times before, but the fatigue has accumulated to a point, the trauma to that tissue has accumulated to a point that we have that injury develop. And I think it's really critical when we talk about this. It isn't that one single instance that led to that injury occurring. If I go into a warehouse and you say, they got hurt lifting up this specific case, well, it isn't that immediate case, that immediate incident that potentially led to that injury. It's that cumulative exposure over time to that body part, to those tissues, to that repetitive loading, to those forceful exertions that potentially drove that fatigue that then contributed to that cumulative injury. And so from our perspective, when we think about ergonomics, when we think about MSI prevention, what we're trying to do is say, how do we remove some of this risk? How do we remove exposure to these awkward postures, to these repetitive motions, to the amount of force that they're having to generate when they perform this activity in order to reduce or prevent that wear and tear, that slow degradation, that accumulated fatigue that these folks experience. And that's where we implement controls. So, I put in a pallet leveler to elevate the height of that so they don't have to bend down as far every time. That's going to be less force I have to generate from those muscles of the back. And from that, I'm able to give that person the ability to rest, recover, manage the physical demands of the work, not accumulate fatigue, go home at the end of the day, get good rest, get a good meal, come back to work the next day, and manage those physical demands over time. And because of that, right, when we make that change, when we make that ergonomic improvement, it reduces that applied force, it reduces that exposure level in that scenario. And I think what's really important to recognize is, especially with really repetitive tasks, especially with really repetitive activities, I don't just benefit from the one time. I benefit from it every single time I perform that activity. So when we make changes to these workstations, to the equipment available, they benefit from it every time they perform that task. Again, potentially hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of times. That can be a lot of accumulated fatigue that we take off the table. That can be a lot of risk that we're able to remove from the workplace. And it increases this margin of safety. So now when I perform that activity, right, I'm not fatiguing as much. I'm not getting that same exposure level. And certainly when I start a new job, I start a new activity I'm not familiar with, my body hasn't built capability around, there's potential that you do accumulate some fatigue, right? I get you to start exercising, you haven't been exercising in a while, you feel sore, right? There's soreness that comes along with that. But what we want to ensure is that people have the ability to adapt, to improve, to rest, recover, so that they don't have that long-term wear and tear, they don't have that degradation of the tissue tolerance, and they never reach the point where, right, that injury occurs. There's enough trauma to that tissue that they get the MSI. The really cool thing about our bodies, we can improve, right? We can strengthen, we can get more flexible. So the more that we do that activity while we manage the physical level of it, the better we're able to protect people from those injuries long term. And again, I think it's important to recognize that because when we talk about risk controls, when we talk about making changes in the workplace, where are those opportunities for us to pull that risk off the table? Where can we reduce the amount of fatigue that they're experiencing, the amount of force that they're generating, the awkward postures that they're working in to help provide more of that protective benefit for workers? That's what's going to help reduce that fatigue and reduce that long-term cumulative risk. And that's really when we talk about the goals of an effective ergonomics program. There's tons of little things we're trying to achieve. Obviously, less injuries, less workers' compensation costs, reduced turnover, reduced absenteeism, engaged workers, more inclusive work environment, less days away from work. At the end of the day, all of these factors are really contributing to these bigger goals. Create safer work conditions, lower risk work conditions, lower organizational costs in terms of what we're paying in direct costs around these claims, but also in indirect costs in terms of, again, managing more of it on the back end. And then improve culture, right? Engage our workers, create that, high quality safety culture that we want for our organization. Critical to that then is our risk management process, right? The way that we get out there, we identify ergonomic risk factors, we assess them, prioritize, control, consult with our team, engage with our team, and validate those outcomes long term. So this is a big part of what we're going to talk about in terms of that roadmap is how do we drive through this process to enable those positive outcomes, to enable those goals that we just talked about, reduce the risk of the work conditions, create safer work environments, create safer work tasks, reduce that physical burden that these folks are experiencing and drive that long-term positive outcome in terms of less injuries, less costs. The reality is when we think about risk management, especially risk management from an ergonomics perspective, from a musculoskeletal injury perspective, there's a lot of roadblocks that we run in along the way. And you guys don't need to read through all these. I just kind of want to emphasize that there's a lot of things that we can be challenged with through that process. I'm going to talk about a couple key ones here in a second, but it's just important to recognize, it's easy to say something. It's harder to actually deliver on it, especially for your organization where you have divided priorities, where you have other things going on, when you're potentially managing safety as part of your other responsibilities. And so having a clear roadmap, having kind of a structured process, having kind of practical actions that you can take, having templated resources really, really helps drive that process long term. So we'll talk about that more in the next section. When we talk about some of those challenges, again, some of the ones I'll emphasize, complexity, right? When we talk about how do I manage these? How do I understand them? How do I tailor it to different audiences? Potentially limited resources, not having the resources to be able to go out there and engage with this challenge, execute, potentially limited expertise, not knowing how, not knowing what are these risk factors? How do I engage and educate my team when I maybe don't even understand them that well? Potentially misconceptions, this idea of, well, we've never had an injury, but there's plenty of risk present, right? That can eventually lead to consequences. Maybe you've been lucky up till then, but being proactive is really, really critical to preventing those injuries long term. And then things like lack of action. Maybe you've started part of the process, you've done some assessments, but you haven't taken those next steps in terms of mitigation. And then engaging our stakeholders, of course, which is critically important. So how can we help? Having that roadmap to success, following from a stepwise process perspective, focusing on long-term impacts, driving down these risk factors, implementing effective programs, having that collaborative partnership, driving all the way through to risk control. We'll talk about that in more detail in the getting started section. And then finally, a practical systems approach. How do we look at this in totality? How do we take a step back and understand from our organization how to get out there and attack that problem? And then templated resource to help you get you started. So for the next section, we're going to talk a little bit about what's required. I'm going to go through a couple of these slides a little quickly just because I want to more point you guys in the direction of additional resources where you can find this information, really to set the table to then talk about, how do I get started in executing, implementing, what do I need in place, and really drive from there. So we'll review some of the regulatory requirements. I'll talk a little bit about, again, the risk management process. In particular about driving through all the way from risk ID and assessment to risk control. And we'll talk about how MSABC can help before we get into tackling this problem. So I think critically important, understanding in particular from a WorkSafeBC perspective, what the relevant part of the regulations are. So the ergonomic MSI prevention requirements section is 4.46 to 4.53. So again, I think it's really important for you guys to kind of know where that is. WorkSafeBC breaks out both requirements, but also guidelines that kind of provide helpful supportive information in terms of, right, well, how do I meet some of these things? What are maybe some of the more specifics related to achieving what's laid out in those requirements? So again, requirements, guidelines, both of them are the same numbered sections, 4.46 to 4.53. We'll talk a little bit about some of the specifics in those as we go through some of this content. The reality is when we talk about an MSI prevention program, regardless of where your organization is located, what kind of industry you operate in, there's really fundamental parts of that process that you need to have in place. Obviously, this can be really overwhelming, right? Looking at this, looking at all these component parts, it can feel overwhelming. So we're really going to focus in on a couple key areas, in particular for getting started. And the first piece is really education and training. It's so hard to have success in executing against these things if people in your organization don't understand what you're talking about. They don't understand the benefit. They don't understand the value. They don't understand the challenge that you're kind of facing and how this can benefit your organization. So this is explicitly laid out in terms of the regulations, in terms of some of those requirements. In particular, they talk about the need for frontline employees, frontline workers to understand what these signs and symptoms of MSIs are. So we'll talk about that more in the next section. I think one thing to recognize as well, when you look at the prevention data from WorkSafe BC, this is the most commonly cited work order from WorkSafe BC when they go to sites, when they look at these things. So again, this is kind of the first area that they tend to find, workers, organizations haven't taken that first step to educate both their frontline employees, but then their team more broadly as well. And MSABC can help with that. And I really want to emphasize as we go through this, the different ways that we can support you through this process, through this journey, both in terms of action planning and in terms of specific resources. Both in terms of frontline training, help educate your frontline team on what these ergonomic risk factors are, what these MSI signs and symptoms are, how to recognize them in the work that they do every day, the importance of early reporting, really, really critical information to engage with your team, ensure that they kind of understand some of these key concepts, and they know what to do when they're experiencing, these signs and symptoms. And then also, more broadly, implementing that effective ergonomics program, you're going to rely on your team, especially your Joint Health and Safety Committee. The regulations talk a lot about specific responsibilities around consultation with the Joint Health and Safety Committee. We'll talk about those in a second, but again, part of that is educating your Joint Health and Safety Committee, educating your supervisors, building that capability in your team so that you know what you're talking about, what you're doing, what the action plan is, and what the key activities are to drive that long-term output, to drive that long-term prevention, right? Help protect workers. The only way we can get there is if we have the know-how to be able to go out there and execute against it. So again, that first part, education and training, right? Building that understanding, building that capability. And then really secondarily to that is your risk management process. At the end of the day, your risk management process is the engine to get this work done, to be able to go out there and actually identify where these risk factors are, to assess and prioritize the highest risk opportunities, and to control that risk, to protect workers, to implement changes in the workplace that minimize those awkward postures, those forceful exertions, all of these ergonomic risk factors that are placing, again, that exposure level onto these workers. So we'll talk about that in more detail. Again, I referenced the specific parts of the regulation here, 4.47 to 4.49, where they, again, talk about risk ID, risk assessment, the specific risk factors that you need to factor in. And again, much like that education and training component, the other two parts of the regulation that are most often referenced from a work order citation perspective are 4.48, 4.47. So again, risk ID, risk assessment. So important to recognize this is something that, WorkSafe BC is looking for, and you really need to have in place to be able to, again, address this challenge long term. I referenced the other sections here too, 4.5, 4.52, 4.53. We'll talk about these in more detail in the later section. But I think critically important is just recognizing the importance of the role of consultation. So engaging with your Joint Health and Safety, engaging with your worker representative, and ensuring that you're consulting with them throughout this process. I'll get into more detail on that in a second here. So we talk about risk management, right? Step one is risk ID, step two, risk assessment, step three, risk prioritization, risk control, risk consultation, and validation. We'll talk about these in more details. Again, I think what's important to recognize is that Joint health and safety and worker representative consultation is a critical component of each of these steps. So we need to be engaging as a team. We need to be taking a collaborative approach. We need to understand what our roles and responsibilities are throughout the process. So when we talk about that risk management process again, the goal at the end of the day, safer work conditions, lower costs, improved culture. How do we drive through to that? Well, it's important to recognize that this is a continuous improvement process. It's not a linear process. So recognizing that this is ongoing work we need to continue to do. We need to monitor these things. We need to ensure that we're engaging with the front line. We're getting out there. We're recognizing where these challenges are. And we're taking action on them, right? We're driving all the way through to that risk control and that validation of those outcomes as well. So this really, again, just provides part of the framework for when we work with organizations, we build action plans, we build programs in terms of, again, getting out there and taking action on these things. These are kind of the typical steps that we would take. Again, important to recognize it's a continuous improvement process. The other thing that's really important to recognize, it requires that organizational commitment. It requires that worker engagement to be effective, right? So it's really, really critical that we're engaging with our team, we're engaging with the right stakeholders to drive those outcomes. Really quickly, again, step one is all about identifying the MSI risk factors that are present in the work. Step two is about that assessment, understanding what the risk level is for that given job task, prioritizing, right, where are these highest risks? What do I need to go out there and intervene with first? Controlling the risk, implementing meaningful risk controls, meaningful risk mitigation strategies to drive down exposure to those MSI risk factors. And consultation, again, it's kind of outlined here as step 5, but the reality is consultation is really critical throughout this process. Both consultation in terms of on the front end, when I'm identifying and I'm assessing specific work areas, folks that have had prior MSIs or who have reported MSI signs and symptoms that work in that area, but then also consultation directly with the Joint Health and Safety Committee to prioritize, to review risk findings, to talk about risk controls, to validate the effectiveness of risk controls on the back end as well. And that's really that kind of final step. It's critically important that we're critical of the work that we're doing, that we're checking ourselves, that we're reviewing when we implement these changes. Are we effectively training workers? Are we effectively educating them on how to use something, the benefit it provides? And are we getting feedback from them in terms of the benefit it's actually providing? Potentially doing risk assessments again to validate changes in risk level, soliciting feedback directly from the team. All of that is really, really critical to the process. I know this looks like a lot, but I want to emphasize again, the whole goal is to have a structured process, have practical steps that you can follow so that you know where you're starting from, where you're going. If we don't have an idea of what that end point looks like, it's really hard to ensure that we're doing the right work along the way. And so this is part of the process we go through from an action planning perspective, helping you from a first step perspective, get started, understand where you're at now, create a plan that's going to be effective for your organization, educate and empower your team, and then from there, driving forward to the risk management process, actually identifying, assessing, prioritizing, controlling these risk factors so that we can, again, provide that protective benefit back to workers that are doing this work every day. And then from there, the long-term outcomes in terms of, once we've identified, we've assessed, actually being able to get out there and minimize exposure to those risk factors so that we can, again, evaluate the impact, we can improve and expand, and we can review and sustain these programs long-term. So at the end of the day, when we talk about kind of that third phase, it's all about checking ourselves. Have we minimized risk effectively? Where we have found effective controls, can we apply those in other areas? If you have multiple facilities, is this a risk factor that you see in another facility that you could take advantage of the same risk control? Really being as efficient as possible in identifying those solutions and implementing them more broadly. And then review and sustain, right? Continuing to monitor the risk, continuing to review emergent incidents that happen, engaging with your team to ensure that you're, again, driving this from a continual improvement perspective. But I want to emphasize, I know that's a lot to look at. We're going to talk primarily today about kind of getting started and then some of the next steps we take from a risk management perspective. But this is all work that MSABC can help support you with as well. So building an action plan that works for your organization, helping you get started, charting the course moving forward. Again, this is a progressive program that you want to implement. So it's really important to, again, have that structured process to drive that long-term success. So where do I start? Right? Again, that should be the first question you're asking. Okay, I understand the importance. I recognize the challenge. Where do I start? How do I actually get started in taking action on this? So we'll talk a little bit about where to pull information from to prioritize across your organization, across your operations, where that risk might be. We'll talk a little bit about, again, this idea of building know-how in your team, educating your frontline team to ensure they understand what ergonomic risks are, what these MSI signs and symptoms are, and then starting that risk management process. Again, identifying these highest risk areas, identifying where these risk factors have been identified, and working through that risk assessment process, working through that prioritization process, and taking action from a risk control perspective. And then we'll kind of jump into the final section where we'll really just talk a little bit about, well, what does it look like in terms of next steps moving forward? How do I expand and sustain my MSI prevention program? So again, we talked about in the other section this idea of, getting started, understanding the current state of your organization, understanding the current challenges that you may have around ergonomics and MSI prevention, creating a targeted strategy, creating an action plan that reflects your guys' organization's need and current state, and then engaging with your team, building buy-in, getting started in terms of some of that training side of things. So when we talk about understanding your current state, certainly one part is right understanding what is expected of you, right? What are the requirements when it comes to MSI prevention, much like what we just covered in the prior section. The other part is then understanding for your own organization, where are we? Right? Where are these MSIs emerging? What work areas are we specifically having issues? What body parts are affected when we think about it from an MSI perspective? It's that idea of like fish where the fish are. Use your metrics to guide you in terms of that prioritization process, in terms of that risk identification process, to then get out there and take action where it's going to be the most impactful. And then potentially industry risks and metrics as well. I'll talk about that in a second, but maybe for your organization, you're quite small and you actually don't have a lot of injury data to kind of refer back to. Taking a look at kind of within your industry, within your sub-industry, what are the trends? What are the risks? What do the metrics show in terms of where these other organizations are having challenges and trying to get ahead of it? Hey, if that's where they're kind of facing these challenges, can we make that better for our organization to be proactive and prevent these injuries in the first place? I'll talk about that in a second here as well. So firstly, again, WorkSafe BC has a health and safety planning toolkit. I highly recommend you guys check it out if you haven't before. Our prior webinar that we did, that Heidi Hare from our team did, she talked about this process of going into the health and safety planning toolkit, accessing your employer report, reviewing your organization's metrics. And that's really what this is all about. Understanding your current state, logging in through your online services portal with WorkSafe BC, reviewing your employer report, and looking for, when it comes to ergonomics, when it comes to MSI prevention, what are we seeing? Things like your experience ratings and trends, how much of an influence has MSIs been on that? What are the injury rates and durations that are captured there? What injury types are we seeing? What body parts, right? In terms of the specific areas of opportunity, what are the claim characteristics, assessment rates, return to work and compliance activities, all that's captured as part of that employer report. Really, when we talk about it from an ergonomics, from an MSI prevention perspective, really we're looking for things like trends over time, in particular MSI trends over time. You can see here, I included in the bottom right there, they actually break out ergonomic claims and kind of where they fall over time. Really helpful to see, is there any seasonal impacts? Is there any trending changes that are occurring? You can look at and identify the work groups that are impacted, what specific job types were these injuries coming from, what were the typical body parts affected, was this an issue of the back, of the shoulder, of the hands and wrists. That can be really helpful, again, in targeting where you're going to go out there and take intervention, and on what potential risk controls you might prioritize on the back end as well. And then things like just your MSI rates, counts, to understand, again, what's the scale of this issue, and what's it costing us organizationally as well. I made that note just about the employer report, right? That's specific to your own organization. You can also look online. They have a risk calculation dashboard that includes kind of industry groups. So you can go look up based on your subsector, based on your specific CU, and it'll actually show you the individual trends, the individual risks. It'll provide kind of comparison points, which can be really, really helpful as well. So I recommend you check that out. Again, this is all really, really powerful information that our prior webinar talked about. So I want to refer you guys back to that. So again, last month we had this Safety 2026 Set Up for Success webinar. You guys can actually go online and access that right now. If you go to the MSABC website, you go to the resources section, there's actually at the very bottom there in the menu, a webinar section. You can go to that location and you can actually access that. It'll show you how to get into your employer report. It'll talk about what important information is captured in there. It'll talk a little bit about some of those industry risks as well. Really, really powerful information to, again, help get you started, right? One other note too is that, this webinar will be available there in the future as well. So that's also where you can kind of go find the information and the content from this session as well. Again, I talked about this before. You can't manage risks without understanding them. So again, the first step is always education and empowerment, building that understanding both in your frontline team and in terms of your joint health and safety committee, your worker representative, your key supervisors who are going to be supporting this process. Building that understanding, building that know-how in the team so that you can have those conversations. It's really difficult to talk about ergonomic risks and what needs to change and how to prevent these injuries. We don't really know exactly what we're talking about, or we're not even saying things in the same words. We're not using the same language to talk about them. So build that common understanding so that you can have those meaningful, thoughtful conversation. That goes a long ways. Part of that, again, I referenced this earlier, but it's so critical that we're educating our workers on what these MSI signs and symptoms are. There's a bit of a canary in the coal mine effect when it comes to MSIs. Often there's early warning indicators that someone's really at risk for developing, this long-term musculoskeletal injury. And those are those signs and symptoms. So when we talked about that kind of slow degradation, that tissue tolerance line going down, often when that's happening, there's warning signs. There's these signs, things that we can directly observe, swelling, redness, loss of strength, lack of mobility, and then potentially symptoms as well, things that the individual, the worker is directly experiencing themselves that maybe I can't see. Numbness, tingling, burning, discomfort, aching, pain. It's really, really critical that we communicate these things to workers so that then when they're experiencing them, especially when they're persisting, they can report that information to us. We know that we need to go out there and intervene to prevent the injury from happening. It's so much more effective to get out there and address it when these first emerge than it is, again, once they've been exposed to those risks for a long time and have that full-on MSI. So again, firstly, build that capability, build that understanding, and then really we dive into our risk management process. And this is really when we talk about that joint health and safety committee training that I just referenced. This is a big part of what we go through during that training. I'm going to go through, of course, a condensed, really quick version of it in terms of what the key steps are. But this is content that we go through in detail. I provide resourcing, I provide templates. We talk about from an action planning perspective as part of that training. Firstly, step one is that identification process. So, creating, what I sometimes refer to as like this job task inventory, a breakdown of all the work that's being done in your facility, on site, across the different departments, jobs, and then again, those individual job tasks. Engaging with your team members, getting feedback from them, looking at reporting around MSI signs and symptoms, looking at reporting around ergonomic risk factors, reviewing previous records over the years, and creating that list, right? Starting to document it. So again, this is one of those explicit things laid out in the requirements, but then they also provide additional guidance in the guidelines section. So you can see I kind of reference that here. I recommend going and checking that out. In there, they provide additional guidance on how to go through and prioritize from a risk identification perspective. In particular, they talk about, again, so step one, create your job task inventory, populate it with all the different tasks that are being performed across your operations, and then really go through that risk identification process. What risk factors are present, and in particular, as we'll talk about here in a second, what are some of the metrics that are maybe influencing that as well? So we have a template that I often use with different members, which enables them to, again, build out that list, build out that comprehensive job task inventory, and then help support that prioritization process from a risk ID perspective. So really critically, as they lay out in the guidelines, one, has there been previous incidents of work-related MSI claims in that specific job task? Is there first aid records of MSI or MSI incident investigations that have shown issues in that specific job task? Has there been worker reporting of MSI signs and symptoms for that specific job task? These are really where we want to go out there and we want to prioritize intervention. I made that analogy before, fish where the fish are. This is where the problems are. So this is where we want to start. get out there, prioritize these areas. We've had injuries in these areas before. We've had reporting of signs and symptoms. Incident investigations have shown issues. Okay, we need to make sure we're going out there and we're prioritizing these job tasks for that assessment and control process. And then looking at other, helpful pieces of information as well. Have supervisors and workers been reporting MSI risk factors? What are they? To what level? To what combination? Are there multiple risk factors present? And then things like worker surveys, interviews, observations, engaging with the team to understand what their experience has been in those specific areas, observing the work to understand, again, what are we seeing? So first step, again, identifying those risks, prioritizing it. Where do we actually need to go out there and do that risk assessment process? And then getting out there and doing those ergonomic risk assessments, right? Part of that training is going through that risk assessment process, learning how to conduct these ergonomic risk assessments, learning how to use effective risk assessment tools. And in particular, during that training, we talk about the MSI worksheet, which I'll show here in a second. The reason that I like to use that as a risk assessment tool is you're going to capture all of the risk factors that are laid out as part of the WorkSafe BC requirements. So in there, they're pretty particular about what risk factors you must consider as part of that risk assessment process. That MSI worksheet captures all of these different factors. So that can be really helpful in terms of, again, ensuring that you're capturing all the information you need. Getting out there, again, based on the priority level we flagged in that job task inventory, conducting those job task assessments, summarizing the findings, and then going through that consultation process, which I'll talk about here in a second. When you've done the assessments, reviewing them as part of your Joint Health and Safety Committee to then say, what do we need to prioritize from a risk control perspective? Where do we need to go out there and actually intervene to implement effective solutions? So again, I made this note. WorkSafe BC has this MSI risk assessment worksheet, which is a really helpful tool to be able to go out there, catalog risk, assess the level of risk, and then help with that prioritization process on the back end. One of the things that we help support with as well from an MSABC perspective, we kind of have like a risk summary forms that we can use that kind of help you to summarize the findings to then make it easier from a consultation perspective to talk with your Joint Health and Safety Committee about what were the major findings, what were the highest risks, what moderate risks did we see, what are the things that we need to prioritize in terms of intervention. Again, this is all stuff we cover in a lot of detail as part of that training. So where do we go, right? We talked about, critically important is that risk assessment process, identify those risks, assess risk, but we can't stop there. I can't emphasize that enough. A risk assessment is only as good as the work that comes after you've done it. And that's fundamentally true, right? Driving through from risk assessment to prioritize, to consult and engage with my team, and to control the exposures is critically important. And that really is what we need to ensure that we're kind of taking as those next steps. Engaging with our teams, working with our Joint Health and Safety Committee, understanding the level of risk, prioritizing where we need to go out there and intervene, and then focus on risk control, focus on mitigation, and engage with our teams, validate that they're having the impact that we want on the back end. And when you're not sure, when you feel like you need more support, when you have questions, ask for help. Again, that's one thing, I'm always happy to provide consultation around is when you're exploring potential risk controls. So again, just referencing those specific WorkSafe BC requirements here. When we get out there, after we've done those assessments, prioritizing where are we seeing these highest risks, where are we seeing the greatest prevalence of multiple risk factors, prioritize those job tasks first, and then from there, control. Engage with the key stakeholders, engage with your Joint Health and Safety Committee, talk with the workers in the area, and brainstorm and get as many perspectives as you can. That's really where you're going to get the best ideas and the best options from a risk control perspective. And then ensure that you're consulting with that Joint Health and Safety Committee, having the conversation about what might work best in those scenarios. A lot of steps here. You guys don't need to kind of memorize these. I just kind of share to again, emphasize that in the same way we want to take a structured approach to our risk management process, we want to take a structured approach to controlling these risks as well, to going through that risk control brainstorming process. And so that's an additional resource that we have at MSABC. This is something that I actually just did some training around at the Make It Safe event. And specifically, how do I go through from a step-by-step process, have that conversation with my team, engage with my Joint Health and Safety Committee to understand where we need to prioritize, and then how do we identify what's going to be effective risk controls based on the risks that we're seeing in those assessments. Let the risk be your guide in terms of what action to take, and then follow that hierarchy of control to ensure, again, we're getting the most effective risk controls that we can. And I think critically important, is, as part of that process as well, is building the business case, building the justification, talking about the ROI and making these changes. When we look at things like MSI costs, both in terms of those direct and those indirect costs, one injury can be really, really costly to an organization, even if you don't have that many MSIs happening. One single injury can be really, really costly to your organization. Again, both from a fiscal perspective, but also from a resource perspective. You're losing a valuable employee to your organization. And so controls help offset those costs. It's not just about adding costs, it's actually about reducing costs long term. It's about removing what we're already paying in terms of these claims, in terms of these indirect costs. And so building the justification for making a change. Here's what it costs to implement this piece of equipment. Here's some of the indirect costs in terms of maintenance long term. But we can see, if this can offset one injury, one back MSI that we've had when we had, 16 the prior year, that's 3.75 times return on investment in direct costs, 15 times return on investment in terms of total costs. And so really, really important that we, again, highlight some of those financials, because when we're talking with our leadership, when we're talking with different stakeholders in our organizations, we want to make sure that we're emphasizing the impact that it can have. And then finally, one final note I'll just make here. Again, consultation, consultation, consultation. It's explicitly laid out as part of those WorkSafe BC regulations, but throughout the process, throughout that risk management cycle we just talked about, whether it's risk ID, assessment, control, review, we want to make sure that we're engaging with our Joint Health and Safety Committee to talk about priorities, to talk about findings, to talk about potential solutions, and to validate outcomes on the back end as well. It's an ongoing cyclical process, so that's something that we want to make sure we're kind of integrating as part of some of the more consistent work that we're doing for our organization. And then one final note here again, right? Once we've done those assessments, reviewing the findings, engaging with our frontline team, doing hands-on reviews of that work area to figure out what's going to work best. How do we address this challenge? And then ensure, again, that we're validating the outcomes. We're reassessing risk. We're showing that change in risk level. And we're protecting workers. That's the goal at the end of the day. Protect workers from these ergonomic risks. And again, just a note here, again, want to emphasize it multiple places, multiple ways. Depending on where you need support, we can help. And so we can also support with training specifically around risk control strategies. All right. So really quick summary again. They continue to be the most prevalent injury type. They're contributing to significant organizational costs and, more importantly, impacts to frontline workers. It's critical to your organization's future success and profitability. Again, there are enormous cost-saving and productivity benefits that come from good ergonomics in the workplace. Understanding where you're at now is critical to creating that path forward, to defining what that action plan looks like, where you prioritize. And then again, focus on high-loss areas, focus on where you're already having challenges, and then drive through that full risk management process. And again, MSA can help. Always, please reach out if you have questions, challenges in those areas. All right. I think I'm pretty much right there, bang on time. So I'll ask Doris to come back on and just let me know any of the questions we might have had come in.
Hi, Will. Thanks. Always informative and so helpful. So we have gotten a few questions.
Awesome.
So one comment from the audience member is that their biggest challenges are aging workforce. Do you have any thoughts on this challenge that they face?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think that's going to continue to be a challenge for organizations moving forward. I think the important thing to recognize or talk about is what changes with aging. The big thing that changes with aging is, we talk about that tissue tolerance going down. We talk about the fatigue that someone experiences. We talk about the recovery. Those things become more and more challenging as we age. It takes us longer to recover from, a given exposure. Any given exposure from, again, an ergonomics perspective in the workplace puts more fatigue, more strain on our body. So I think really important to recognize when you're doing that risk assessment process, we need to ensure that we are considering a representative sample. Consider the different folks that do that job so that we can ensure that we're not just documenting risk for, one individual. We're looking at those other individuals. And again, those aging individuals in the workplace as well. Are their exposures different? How and why? And how do we ensure that when we're looking at the risk controls, we can layer those things on to support that? So firstly, as always, again, from a risk management perspective. And then I think secondly, thinking about secondary factors and ways that we can support aging workforces, things like, helping them maintain mobility and strength levels, good hydration, good lifestyle habits. Those things have protective benefits as well. That can help, but again, it all starts with risk management. It all starts with recognizing, right, if these folks represent a good portion of your workforce, then you need to control risk in that way to protect them.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, great question.
Another question came in. Since everybody's body is unique for a given task,
Yeah,
is there a reliable method process to determine whether someone is A, gaining strength and endurance, B, holding steady, maintaining capability,
yeah.
and C, slowly fatiguing, reducing safety margin, and heading towards injury?
Yeah, great question. So it's funny, both these questions are related back to the representative sampling piece, which I wanted to put in here, but I pulled out for time. It all
So the
back
only
to,
thing I was going to add to that, sorry, Will,
yeah,
is
go
that
ahead.
they added on that because many times the workers report the discomfort, they don't, or many times it seems workers report no discomfort up until the point of injury. And then, of course,
Yeah.
when proactively asked, sorry, I forgot to add that
No,
extra
it's good
thing.
context too. I think that's always going to be a challenge, right? Sometimes that's a cultural challenge as well in terms of your organization. Do workers feel that they can bring those things forward? So I think one part of that is, maybe some work on more of the psychological safety side of things to figure out how do we engage workers more effectively? How do we create an environment where they feel more comfortable sharing things? You see this a lot, especially in
Hmm.
particularly blue collar work environments where workers they're kind of muscling through stuff, even though they maybe are experiencing some of these signs and symptoms. They're not bringing it forward. But again, talking with the workers, engaging with the workers, talking about the benefit to them specifically. How does getting ahead of these things set them up for success long term, enable that long term longevity in the role, prevent these injuries, prevent the impacts to their quality of living that are going to impact their ability to do their job, but they impact
Hmm.
their life, right? I think we
Yeah,
all know folks that have muscled through a lot of injuries throughout their career and they get to the end and they don't have that high quality of living. I've
yeah,
experienced that firsthand in terms of my parents and having very blue collar work. And so one part of it's culture, and then the other part of it is when we talk about that risk management process, we have to ensure we're doing representative sampling. So when I'm going out to look at a specific work area, when I'm doing assessments, I can't just narrow in on that one worker that happens to be working at that station when I go out there. We need to ensure we're
right.
thinking about how does it vary across the different workers who do this job? Heights, ages, experience levels, and make sure that we're doing some analysis around how that might vary. Because it might point us in the direction that we need to implement risk controls that specifically support a given group. That can be
Yeah,
really, really helpful.
yeah.
Great
Okay, I
questions.
know we are coming close to the end of the time, but there's an important one here that I think everyone could benefit from. A follow-up comment slash question. WorkSafe BC has an iceberg theory example that shows the relationship between direct costs and indirect costs. Something again you were referencing as far as the ROI
Yeah,
you're making your business costs. So for $1 saved on direct costs, there is approximately $4 saved on indirect costs. I've seen different calculations for the iceberg theory in a safety textbook. Do you have a source for the relationship between direct and indirect costs? As this would help not only this person, but others, build their business cases for safety.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a source, immediately handy, but that's
Yeah.
something that I could very easily provide. And I think in particular, if that's an item of interest, obviously for the person that asked it, but for other people as well, please reach out because I can provide you some additional resources.
Okay.
To their point, there's a number of different resources that exist out there that help from an ROI perspective. How do I build cost justification? That's something that I'm always happy to engage and help with because I know that can be a challenge, but it's so critically important. If I can't get that buy-in from my organization, from my leadership group to understand, no, 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 not only does this protect our workers, it benefits our organization. It helps
Yeah.
drive
Hmm.
those long-term costs down. Again, especially if you have already prevalent challenges around MSI claims and costs associated with them.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
it's a great question. I certainly have resources that I can share. So
Hmm.
that's something I think reach out, and I'm more than happy to help you build that out in terms of what does that look.
Okay. Perfect.
Love that.
So, man, they're coming in fast and furious. So, we are not going to be able to get to everybody's question, but please know we will take these back and we'll have Will follow up on them. So, don't worry, we will definitely circle back with you if we can't do it today. So, the last question I'm going to just read out. Matt has welding stations where product is pushed into a static height conveyor line. The challenge is accommodating workers from between 5'4" to 6'7". And so his question is, should full risk assessments be done with all workers? And is there a way to make it safe for everyone, or do you have to compromise?
Great question. So in terms of the assessment, I'll start on the assessment side of things. My recommendation is always, especially when you have significant variance across a worker population, figure out what the extremes are because that's going to give you really good endpoints to how it can vary. So to your point, 5'4" to 6'7", look at both of those workers and compare. I can probably estimate already that 5'4" worker is going to have significantly higher shoulder risk. The amount of time that they're spending with their shoulder, their arm elevated above that shoulder height, the repetition rate of that, the force that they're generating, that's all going to be significantly higher. So that's part one. You don't necessarily need to do assessments of all the workers, but pick some of the extremes, pick some of the end ranges, and make sure they're represented when you do that risk assessment. And in terms of the second part, in terms of like, how do I accommodate? Do I have to compromise? My recommendation is always understand how the work is done. If it's one worker that's working at that station for a set period of time, can we put in something that's maybe removable where when that worker who is maybe shorter is at that station, we can put in some place something that accommodates them to help them in those scenarios. And then when we have someone else who doesn't need that, who that would actually maybe elevate their back risk if we made that a permanent change, then we can remove it for those workers. So then you can kind of set the station, setup is fundamental to ergo success. So you can kind of set up the
Yeah.
station based on the person there. Obviously, perfect solution would be height adjustability in terms of either the conveyor itself or the platform that they're standing on.
Yeah.
Obviously, we know that can be expensive. So, what are ways that we can accommodate based on whoever's working there at a given time? That can be an effective approach.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Well, we are out of time now. Thank you so much for joining us today, Will. And thank you so much to everyone on our call that has tuned in. We very much appreciate you joining us for these webinars.